data mapping template as a resource for IEP teams when an evaluation has been initiated for a student suspected of having a specific learning disability. The intent of this webinar is to orient teams to the data mapping template. The data mapping template is a tool intended to support teams in organizing data and other relevant information and align this data with the required criteria for SLD identification within the 2020 policy. The tool has several potential purposes, which include the following. The tool could be used during the installation phase to test whether the data necessary to establish each of the criteria is available and interpretable prior to broad implementation across the system. Also, during the installation phase, the tool could be used to identify gaps in data collection and evidence to support team decision-making. And finally, during the implementation phase, the tool could be used to gather and organize data to support sound team decision-making around the 5 criteria for SLD eligibility. The 2020 SLD policy is organized around 5 required criteria, which are illustrated in this graphic. The evaluation is based on the convergence of data from multiple sources, including existing data that comes forward to the evaluation team, as well as data that is gathered during the evaluation process. Beginning with criterion 1, lack of appropriate instruction. This requirement, which applies to all evaluations for any area of suspected disability, directs teams to document that the referred student has been provided with instruction and interventions that are sufficient to allow for adequate progress. Criterion 2, exclusionary factors are for the purpose of ruling out any of these factors as the primary reason for a student's inadequate achievement and insufficient progress. Criterion 3, inadequate achievement, documents that the student is not meeting age or grade level standards when provided learning experiences and instruction appropriate for the child's age or grade. Insufficient progress, criterion 4, is an assessment of the student's progress in response to instruction and intervention and demonstrates either a lack of response or that the student responds at a rate that's insufficient to reduce risk over time. And finally, criterion 5 applies to all areas of disability, establishes that there is an adverse effect as a result of the disability and a need for special education. The data mapping template is found within the MTSS Implementation Guide under the SLD Eligibility tab. For criterion 1, we begin by documenting the percentage of students in the same grade as the referred student that are meeting benchmarks. Again, this is existing data. For students from cultural and/or linguistic minority populations, the team may want to compare the student's performance with that of peers who are of the same language and/or cultural background. In Section B, we look at effective implementation of core instructional practices provided to the student. This might include classroom walkthroughs, checklists, and observations that ensure instruction is implemented with integrity. Next, in Section C, we look at attendance data that assures the student had access to instruction and intervention. In Section D, the evaluation team must document the interventions are supported by scientific research and align with the academic area of need. Teams must document the intervention delivered, the frequency and duration, the group size, and variables that were altered to intensify intervention. We must also include evidence that the intervention was delivered by qualified personnel who were trained, had access to coaching, and sufficient materials to deliver the interventions as intended. We continue with documenting evidence the intervention was delivered for the planned number of sessions and for the full allotted time. In G, we look at group response to the intervention to document that the student's response was unique when compared to similar peers receiving the same intervention. And in section H, we look directly at the student's attendance during the intervention. For criterion 2, exclusionary factors, in most instances, this will also be existing data that moves forward into the evaluation. This might include vision and hearing screening information, parent or caregiver reports, observation data, and a review of school records, including discipline records, attendance records, grades, and the primary language and migrant status of the student. In this next section, we combine criterion 3 around inadequate achievement and criterion 4, insufficient progress. Here we're looking at specific student level data. Again, much of this evidence could be existing evidence that is used to document the student's discrepancy or gap and insufficient progress. The evaluation team gathers data including outcome assessment data, universal screening, interim benchmark data, progress monitoring, classroom-based observations, and information provided by the parent or caregiver in the skill areas of concern. We also document diagnostic data that is gathered to identify students' specific skill deficits and strengths, to determine the instructional focus, and inform decisions on how to adapt and individualize instruction. During the comprehensive evaluation, the evaluation team analyzes the progress monitoring data, including the trajectory of the student's progress as compared to that of typical students. Analysis of the graph data is a critical feature of making a reliable and valid determination as to whether the student's progress is sufficient to reduce their risk of failure in an appropriate length of time. Progress monitoring data documents that the intervention time and intensity is appropriate, it was delivered with fidelity, it was effective for other students receiving the intervention, and summarizes the problem-solving process. Criterion 5 establishes there is an adverse effect as a result of the disability and a need for special education.